Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Ready to cheek. Bitchy? I know. It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, where we cut through the myths and nostalgia to get to the raw, unvarnished truth about the past. With sharp analysis, a feminist lens, and just the right amount of bitchiness, we're here to show you that history isn't just something to study, it's something to question. Let's get started. Welcome back to Bitchy History, the podcast where we cheerfully dismantle all things you thought were just natural, from gender roles to political systems, and replace them with the ugly truth. They were made up, usually by men with too much time on their hands and reinforced by institutions that absolutely did not have women's best interest at heart. Today, we are kicking off a new arc for the show, Inventing Womanhood. Because here's the deal. Woman isn't some eternal, unchanging identity handed down from biology like eye color or bone density. No, women and men, too, for that matter, is a category that society's constructed, enforced, and policed. And those definitions have changed wildly across time and place. If gender were truly biological, then it would look the same in 13th century Florence, Han Dynasty China, and Victorian London, and in your local Walmart parking lot. But it doesn't. Gender changes, gender adapts, gender is rewritten as often as Hollywood reboots Spider-Man. Take the colors pink and blue. Today, pink is a girl, blue is a boy. It's on baby shower invitations, gender reveal cakes, and Target's toddler aisle. But go back a few centuries and you'll find Jesus himself, yes, the Christ child, halo and all, painted in pink robes in the 1280s. Or Baron de Holbach, Enlightenment philosopher, striking a perfectly serious portrait in 1766 wearing rosy tones. Neither the painter Duccio nor de Holbach was signaling feminine energy. In fact, they were wearing what was considered to be a strong masculine color for the time. So what happened? How did pink go from baby boy bold to baby girl delicate? Why have everyone from priests to philosophers to politicians been continuously rewriting what it means to be a woman? And what does it say about our supposedly natural categories when they've been built, torn down, and rebuilt again like a bad HGTV series? Today we are going to dig into the invention of gender categories, how clothing, religion, and philosophy constructed the idea of being a woman. And yeah, we're going to be pretty bitchy about it, because you deserve to hear something better than it's just biology. So let's start with the low-hanging fruit, the pink and blue colors. Because if anything screams socially constructed nonsense, it's the fact that pink, today's international symbol of girlhood, used to be the symbol for manliness. Before the 19th century, nobody cared about pink or blue as a seriously gendered issue for infants. In fact, nobody really cared about color in children's clothing at all. Babies and toddlers were usually dressed almost identically, regardless of sex, usually in white dresses or something similar. Why? Practicality. Plain cotton or linen could be bleached and cleaned much more easily than any other color. Dresses were adjustable. They had hems that could be let down as a child grew. Parents weren't out here trying to make a political statement. They were just trying to keep their messy little chaos goblins clothed in something that could be easily washed. The British Library reminds us that children didn't really start wearing more gender-specific clothing until around 6 or 7 years old, when they were a little less likely to destroy everything they wore in the mud. Up until then, boys and girls were essentially indistinguishable in their very bleach-friendly outfits. So the next time someone tells you it's just natural to put a baby girl in pink, picture your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents dressing every toddler like a tiny Victorian poltergeist. By the mid-19th century, things began to change. Enter the rise of mass-produced children's clothing and, crucially, mass advertising. This is when colors started getting marketed as gender-coded. But here's the kicker. It wasn't the way you think. In fact, pink was for boys and blue was for girls. A 1918 issue of Earnshaw's Infants Department, a trade publication, explained it like this. The generally accepted rule is pink for boys and blue for girls. Why? Because pink, as a lighter version of red, was associated with strength, war, and masculinity. Blue, meanwhile, was linked to the Virgin Mary, who was traditionally depicted in soft blue robes, making the color feminine, delicate, and spiritual. Imagine explaining that to someone today at a gender reveal party. Actually, Karen, pink is for your son because it's a baby-sized version of Blood and Fire. Blue is for your daughter because the Virgin Mary wore it. Now put down the confetti cannon before you start another forest fire. So when did pink switch teams? For that, we need to fast forward to post-World War II America. During the war, women had been wearing overalls, factory uniforms, military gear, in fact. Fashion was practical and androgynous because bombs were dropping and no one was worried about whether their lipstick matched their shoes. That said, later on in this series, we will be talking about the fact that people did care about your lipstick matching your shoes during the war. It's a weird period. That's not to say that women weren't encouraged to look their best to remind men what they were fighting for, but no one expected women to rivet something while wearing a frilly dress. But once the war ended, society wanted to shove women back into the home, and what better way to do it than by reinventing femininity? Enter Mamie Eisenhower, First Lady of the United States. Mamie adored the color pink. It matched her skin tone and her blue eyes. She looked great in it. At Dwight Eisenhower's 1953 inauguration, she wore a rhinestone-studded pale pink ball gown with opera gloves. The message could not have been clearer. Rosie the Riveter could feel free to pack up her denim. Femininity was back, and it was a blushing color. Mamie became so associated with pink that she was dubbed the mother of pink. Advertisers jumped on the trend like a rabid TikTok influencer. Pink kitchens, pink bathrooms, pink cotton balls. Pond's cold cream was sold in pink compacts. Even sanitary napkins were dyed pink so women could, feel dainty while they were menstruating. Because nothing says, I don't get cramps, like pink-colored Kotex. Mamie herself played into the stereotype with lines like, "Ike runs the country, I turn the pork chops," which is both horrifying and deeply on brand for the 1950s. Hollywood also helped cement the pink takeover. In the 1957 film, Funny Face, fashion editor Maggie Prescott, based on real-life Vogue editor Diana Vreeland, belts out the anthem "Think Pink," urging women everywhere to embrace the color. Prescott even sings about banishing blue and burning black, two colors that, incidentally, women had worn in abundance during wartime as mourning clothing and denim workwear.
I tell her if she's gotta think pink. Thanks.
Ales, juice, forbidding was why the feet. Things,
Cheerfully. Think to face to.
Some women use the color as a type of armor. Donna Mae Mims, the first woman to win a Sports Car Club of America championship in 1963, painted her helmet, her cars, and her jumpsuits pink. She called herself the Pink Lady. Why? Because if she leaned into femininity, she could compete against men without seeming too threatening. Historian Lynn Perrell calls this tactic pink think, using pink to signal harmlessness, then go out and smoke the competition. Politicians do it too. Hillary Clinton, often accused of being too masculine, appeared on the cover of People magazine in a bright pink jacket during her 2008 presidential run. The jacket softened her image while she was literally campaigning to break the highest, hardest glass ceiling that exists. Still haven't broken that one. Even villains use pink strategically. The Plastics in Mean Girls declare, "On Wednesdays we wear pink," weaponizing color as social control. Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter hides her authoritarian cruelty under frilly pink suits. Pink isn't inherently soft or sweet, but it is a weaponized signal of it. The lesson here? Color isn't biology, it's branding. Pink has been the outfit of Jesus, a philosopher's choice, a first lady's aesthetic, a villain's camouflage, and a feminist politician's armor. If gender were truly natural, pink wouldn't have spent the last 1,000 years switching teams more often than a professional athlete. So no, your baby girl isn't born loving pink, she's born loving milk. The rest is marketing. If color coding reveals the surface-level nonsense of gender, religion reveals its roots, because once you put patriarchy in the mouth of God, good luck arguing with that. In Confucian thought, the universe itself was structured by yin and yang, complementary forces meant to balance each other. Sounds great. Except yin got stuck with all the worst adjectives. Yin was dark, passive, cold, and lowly. Guess who was yin? Yeah, women, obviously. Yang, on the other hand, was bright, active, warm, noble. Yang represented men, of course. Han Dynasty scholar Dong Zhuangzhu literally wrote, "Yang the venerable, Yin the lowly." In other words, the cosmos itself said that men were better. The Book of Changes laid out rules that a woman's place was inside and a man's place was outside. Women were confined to the domestic inner sphere while men controlled the outer sphere, not because of economics or politics, but because the universe allegedly demanded it. So instead of patriarchy being a system of power, it was rebranded as a cosmic balance, or as I like to call it, universal gaslighting. Of course, exceptions did exist. Empress Wang Zetian became China's only female emperor in the Tang dynasty, but she was treated as an anomaly, even a monstrosity in some ways. Historians painted her as ruthless, unnatural, or scheming precisely because she disrupted their whole script of the yin and yang. Patriarchy only works if outliers get labeled as freaks. Meanwhile, in the West, Christianity was busy running its own gender scam, and spoiler, it wasn't great for Eve. Tertullian, a church father in the 3rd century, called women the devil's gateway. Why? Because Eve ate the fruit, tempted Adam, and according to him, caused the fall of mankind. Thanks, Eve. Because you had a snack, every woman after you gets blamed for sin, suffering, and mortality. Augustine doubled down, teaching that women were spiritually weaker, naturally subordinate, and needed male authority to guide them. And St. Paul's letters didn't help. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be quiet. That verse has been quoted for hundreds of years to justify silencing women in both the church and politics. This wasn't just about pews. It shaped law, education, and daily life. Women were barred from the priesthood, kept from higher learning, and shamed for being too independent. Eve eats one piece of fruit and suddenly every woman in history has to pay for it. Meanwhile, Adam also ate the fruit, but apparently men get to blame that one on peer pressure. Medieval sermons targeted women for vanity, gossip, lust, portraying them as walking sin factories. And if you think this theology is just dusty history, think again. Modern complementarian churches still use Eve to argue against female pastors and leadership. In the medieval Islamic world, jurists faced a tricky question. What about people who didn't fit neatly into the context of man or woman? Islamic law recognized a category that roughly was equivalent to being intersex. And here's the key. The legal system needed to slot every person into a gendered role because inheritance, marriage, and prayer rituals depended on it. So jurists developed elaborate rules to decide whether someone should count as male or female. Sometimes based on physical signs, sometimes based on behavior. The results, even when reality showed that human sex didn't always fit into 2 neat boxes, the law worked overtime to shove people into them. Congratulations, your body is complicated, but our paperwork only has 2 checkboxes. Better luck next time. By the time we get to Greek philosophy and Enlightenment thinkers, gender policing had new branding: reason versus nature. Aristotle wrote in Generation of Animals that women were essentially incomplete men, misbegotten males. He thought the male body was the perfect form and the female body was a failed attempt. Women contributed matter and reproduction, men contributed the form and soul. Without men, women were just incomplete vessels. Imagine being so committed to misogyny that you look at half the population and say, looks like a factory defect to me. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, philosophers are busy writing about liberty, equality, and universal rights. Except when it comes to women. Rousseau in Emile, 1762, laid out his vision of education. Boys should be trained in reason, independence, and civic virtue. Girls, they should be educated to please and serve men. Their role was to charm, to soothe, to reinforce male authority. So in the same breath that Enlightenment thinkers declared all men are created equal, they invented new justifications for why women were naturally excluded from the category of universal man. By the 19th century, these ideas fused with imperialism and race. Gail Betterman shows how manliness became a marker of civilization itself. White middle-class men claimed their virility, intellect, and self-control proved their superiority. Not just over women, but over all colonized peoples. The binary between man and woman mirrored the same binary between civilized and savage. By the time the 19th century rolled around, patriarchy had already been dressed up in religious robes, cosmic philosophy, and Enlightenment contradictions. But the Victorians managed to weaponize science itself. They didn't just say women belonged in the home because Eve sinned or because Aristotle thought they were defective. They brought out microscopes, calipers, and medical textbooks and announced with a straight face that biology proved that women belonged in the home. Victorian Britain was obsessed with dividing the world into categories: male, female, public, private, civilized, savage. Gender wasn't just an identity, it was a cornerstone of the social order, and the proof that this order was natural was about to get a lab coat makeover. Men with calipers and medical titles would soon claim to measure women into their proper place. But the full story for that is in our next episode. Victorian society built an entire ideology out of pseudoscience, the doctrine of separate spheres. Men were designed for the public sphere, politics, business, academia, while women were just naturally suited for the private sphere, the home. This wasn't just cultural, it was reinforced legally and architecturally. Houses were designed with male studies for intellect and female parlors for hospitality. One room was for thinking, the other was for pouring tea. The British Academy has shown how this ideology was enforced, not just culturally, but legally. Married women lost their legal identity under the concept of coverture, which I've done an entire episode on way back in the series. They couldn't own property in their own right. Their duty was to be the moral guardians, mothers, and wives. The angel in the house became the ideal. Pure, selfless, moral, endlessly sacrificing. And if you didn't fit the angelic mood, you were a fallen woman, a social problem, a scandal. The system was self-perpetuating. Science claimed that women were naturally domestic. Society forced them into domestic roles, and then science pointed at women in domestic roles and said, see, nature wins again. It was a loop. And this was a scam with global implications. Gender became a template for empire. Victorians claimed women were naturally submissive, and they also claimed that non-Europeans were the same, childlike, irrational, effeminate. Colonized men are cast as effeminate, colonized women were cast as hypersexual. It was the same trick repeating, naturalizing white male hierarchy by declaring it biologically inevitable. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Writers like John Stuart Mill argued for women's rights. Early feminists pointed out the absurdity of claiming women were too delicate for intellectual labor when poor women were working in factories, fields, and households the entire time. But the weight of science was heavy, and it reinforced cultural norms that we're still dealing with today. The British Library makes it clear women were portrayed as pure, moral, and domestic, not because they always were, but because society demanded it. Literature, sermons, magazines all hammered this idea into place. Women who strayed from it, working class women, unmarried women, women in public life, were treated as deviants. And here's the ridiculous part. For all their obsession with women's supposed fragility, Victorian men relied on women to keep their entire system running. Women managed the households, raised the children, upheld the moral standards, and in many cases still worked outside the home. Of course, by the late 19th century, this ideology was under strain. The rise of women's suffrage movements, women entering universities, and challenges to imperialism in general exposed cracks in the system. But instead of admitting gender was a human construct, defenders doubled down. They insisted that the very survival of civilization depended on keeping men and women in their natural roles. And doesn't that sound familiar? Even today, when conservatives rail against gender ideology, they're replaying the same exact Victorian panic. Back then, it was the womb shriveling from too much math. Today, it's society collapsing if someone puts their pronouns in an email signature. The script hasn't changed, it's just been updated with a few new costumes. So let's pause here. We've traced the invention of gender categories from colors to cosmic philosophy, from Eve to Aristotle, and now into the Victorian obsession with science and spheres. Each step claimed to reveal the truth of womanhood, but each step was simply reshaping the scam to fit the needs of men at the time. In our next episode, we will be diving into the full-blown age of scientific policing. We'll look at how medicine handled intersex bodies, how sex testing in sports tried to enforce binaries, and how thinkers like Judith Butler blew up the myth of natural categories. We'll see how the panic over gender has repeated itself every time the system is challenged. Because here's the truth. Gender is not timeless, it's fragile. It needs constant reinforcement through sermons, laws, pseudoscience, and pink kitchen sets. Because if it weren't propped up, it might just collapse under its own set of contradictions. And if that's not the definition of a scam, I don't know what is. That's it for this episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed the show, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, review, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.
History. History.
Want a bitch, right?